Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone who's joining us today for this first event, the human rights of all the persons and frontier issues, building capacities for effective protection from multilateral scenarios. And excellencies, colleagues, friends, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Monica Ferro, and I'm the director of UNFPA's office here in Geneva. I warmly welcome all of you to this first event of the virtual roundtable series, Mainstreaming Knowledge on Aging, and it's my absolute pleasure to join you today as the moderator. As we all know, throughout the years, different stakeholders, they've struggled to find effective promotion and protection for the rights of for human rights of older persons. As a result, we know that landmark steps have been taken at international level to strengthen the protection of this group, including UN principles for older persons, the adoption of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, the creation of the open-ended working group for the purpose of strengthening the protection of human rights of older persons, the creation of the mandate for the UN independent experts on the enjoyment of all human rights by older persons, and the UN Decade for Healthy Aging, as well as the adoption of many specific resolutions in the framework of the UN General Assembly and, most notably, the UN Human Rights Council. And no one denies that remarkable progresses have been achieved. Mechanisms, programs, projects, plans, and campaigns that have been developed to implement and follow up on the commitments that were undertaken both at the local, national, regional, and international levels. Still, several challenges remain today towards the full enjoyment of the rights of older persons. Problems as ageism, together with gender and other causes of discrimination, as well the intergenerational gap, have increased due to different frontier issues, in particular new technologies, human mobility, and climate change. In addition, we all know that there are still pending tasks to ensure the dignity and human rights of this group, particularly in accessing health and long-term care, lifelong learning, the labor market, as well as the prevention of abuse and violence. In this regard, we did think that an integral approach was needed to maximize synergies and identify interlinkages across existing and future initiatives. Also, a better understanding of the missing elements is useful to provide the necessary attention, resources, information, options for integration and services for older persons, including those who are migrants and refugees. So the experience coming from aging place elderly people in a strategic position for supporting this endeavor. In order to support this aspiration, these webinars were set in place. And this is a joint initiative led by UNITAR and its 24 international training centers for authorities and leaders, CIFAL, Global Network, UNDESA, UNFPA, IOM, UN Women, UNHCR, WHO, ITU, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, together with the International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuses, the International Longevity Center, and the Global Initiative on Aging Foundation, have joined efforts to put together this virtual roundtable series as a contribution to inclusive learning through enriching dialogues and with different stakeholders. And this is why we have prepared for you a stellar panel today to share expertise, to guide us in our discussions, and also to help us change the narrative and change the focus, the length with which we discuss and analyze these pressing issues. And we are going to start, we just have here a technical issue. And for the first topic, we're going to start with Ambassador, His Excellency, Ambassador Frederico Villegas, who's going to honor us with a keynote speaker. Ambassador Frederico Villegas is the president of the UN Human Rights Council and is also the permanent representative of Argentina to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. He has a wide experience in human rights, disarmament, international security, the prevention of mass atrocities, and cooperation for development issues. Among other achievements, he has coordinated with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights the elaboration of the first national plan against discrimination and the establishment of the Center for Public Policies on Human Rights of Mercosur and the International Center for Human Rights of UNESCO, both based in Argentina. It is a pleasure to welcome you, Ambassador, considering the critical role the Human Rights Council as an intergovernmental body within the United Nations system, within the human rights architecture, who's also responsible for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights, where the mandate of the independent expert on the enjoyment of all human rights by all the person was created in 2013, as well as I've mentioned, several resolutions, panels, reports, and other initiatives of the rights of this group have been developed, and having you as a champion. But Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. Thank you, Monica, for the introduction, and to all the organizers for the invitation. I will try to share 5 ideas on what the Council is doing, but also which is the potential of the Human Rights Council to develop a progressive development of the human rights of older persons. First of all, we have to remember always that human rights is one of the 3 pillars of the United Nations, but it's not in silos. It's not these 3 pillars are not do not work in silos. On the contrary, if there is something we have learned, is that they not only they are interlinked, but human rights is the mainstreaming of human rights is the essential tool for peace and security and for development. Therefore, I think today more than ever, we can see that without a strong human rights institutions, we cannot have peace, we cannot prevent conflicts, and strong human rights institutions are the best way of reconstruct societies after a conflict. And at the same time, on development, we have concluded for practice, for history, for reality, that there's no inclusive, sustainable development without a human rights perspective. So therefore, when we talk about the 3 pillars, it's not just any other pillar, it's actually the key pillar to make the other 2 pillars work. In that context, the second idea, several issues have started not necessarily from a human rights perspective. So that is something that we are still struggling. Well, it's not like what they say, you know, what is in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. And some people think that what's in Geneva stays in Geneva. And what we do in Geneva is a Geneva issue. And if there is something we learn is that what we do on the human rights pillar here in Geneva is basically affecting every single human being in the world, because one of the main roles of the Council is the hub for the progressive development of human rights on all thematic issues. Therefore, aging and the situation of older persons have been addressed for many decades through the development, with the development lens. And if you look at the history, how it was addressed in the Third Committee, in the General Assembly, definitely has been addressed like other issues from the development part of the population or the demographics. And for quite a time already, we have a human rights perspective. And the Human Rights Council, because of the reality of the vulnerability and the need for special protection for the rights of older persons, we have developed in the Council several instruments. Of course, the most outstanding is the independent expert, a special procedure. We started with 1 procedure in 1980. Today, we have 47 special procedures and thematic procedures on different issues. One is this, the older persons. So in that context, we have certain issues that are mainstreaming, and it is true. In part of the discussions when a group of countries are, like Argentina, are proposing to start working on an international instrument, specific instrument for the protection of the human rights of other persons, of course, the natural discussion is, do we need that? Because if you look at the covenants and the civil and political rights and the socio-economical rights, plus other treaty bodies, we could start saying, well, every human being is covered by those covenants. Why do we need something specific? And this discussion, we had it for decades with children, we had it with women, we had it with persons with disabilities, and we are having it with other persons. And guess what? As you know, those other three groups also were groups that were being addressed and looked upon from the population, from the development issue. And we decided that they needed special protection because the structural discrimination that they had required a special protection by an instrument. And therefore, now what is the turn? And of course, in those cases, we had decades of discussions until we arrived to a consensus to have an instrument. It didn't happen overnight. What we are witnessing today is that all the persons is no longer a population or a development issue. It's a human rights issue. But also, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown in real face of real people the theoretical discussions that we had for 10 years in the open-ended working group on the structural vulnerability of older persons in many situations. All those discussions that we had so many experts from all over the world telling us the violence, the financial violence, the lack of autonomy, so many issues. We saw it during the pandemic in the face of people dying, people suffering because they weren't able to exercise themselves their rights within a context of pandemic. So as the last point, we think that the Human Rights Council can have a specific role in this new phase of progressive development of human rights of other persons. In that sense, not only we have had the independent expert with the mandate renewed with very important reports, but most recently, last year, for the first time in history, we approved a substantive resolution on the rights of older persons. And that resolution approved last year started talking not only on the rights and substantive ideas, but also on something that even during the negotiation was not easy to explain, which is ageism and discrimination based on age. And I can tell you, because many of stakeholders here were part of the discussions, at the beginning it was very hard because the term ageism was not even clear in all languages, was not translated in some of the languages. We even had to explain what we were talking about. But you know what? It was approved by consensus with over 50 co-sponsors countries. That means that if the first time that we address a substantive resolution, already introducing a new term that is not well known, it has been in many reports, but intergovernmentally has not been discussed. But even though those odds and challenges, we were able to pass a resolution by consensus with over 50 co-sponsors. That is a proof that something is cooking, and we need to continue to cook this special international protection for the rights of other persons. The Human Rights Council will continue to be the hub for this progressive development. And I hope, as I always say, that when we approved the decade of a healthy aging last year, and we participated with Monica, one of the first events last year, actually in 2020, I think it was. I hope that at the end of the decade of healthy aging, we have a new instrument for the protection of the human rights of older persons. Thank you very much. And you have my full support during the presidency for this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you not only for taking us on a journey of what has been done and how these issues have been framed and how they have been put to discussion, but especially thank you for your optimism and for your leadership. I think it's very clear that something is cooking, and by the looks of it and by the smell of it, I think we're all going to enjoy it very much. But Ambassador, thank you so much for your commitment. It's very heartwarming to see someone who fully understands the strategies behind it and the importance of human rights as the pillar of everything that we are doing in the UN system and in the international community. Thank you very much. And now we're going to continue with our panelists. And I take this opportunity to start to present one of our colleagues, one of my colleagues from the UN, who's going to share some information from their perspective and from their expertise fields on existing initiatives and standards on the demographic worldwide scenario, human mobility, digital divide, and climate change as frontier issues to the rights of all the persons. And I invite you all to send your questions or comments by the Zoom chat function. We will pick them in the end of the presentations and try to also have a lively debate between the panelists and those of you who are joining us today. So let me start by welcoming Rio Ada. He is currently leading the work of the Office of the High Commissioner on the human rights of older persons. And he also serves as the Joint Secretary at WEDESA for the open-ended working group on aging that was established by the General Assembly with a mandate to strengthen the protection of human rights of older persons. In 2020, Rio has coordinated the drafting of the Secretary General policy brief on the impact of COVID on older persons, which was a landmark instrument also to understand the impact of COVID as it was mentioned here today. Over the last 2 years, the Office of the High Commissioner has also undertaken a major initiative to analyze the normative and protection gaps in the enjoyment of all human rights of older persons, and it has developed options to address such gaps and produced a working paper in 2021 and the report of the High Commissioner that was presented to the Human Rights Council in March 22. The Office of the High Commissioner also actively collaborates with the other partner agencies such as ourselves and ICLANO Officer WHO to support the implementation of the UN Decade of Healthy Aging that Ambassador Villegas just referred to, and also the mainstreaming of human rights of older persons in the work of the UN system, and they do much more than this. Rio, show us the work that you are doing. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Monica, for your kind introduction. And OSHR is very pleased to join forces with UNITAR and other UN partners to mainstream aging and uphold the rights of other persons as a contribution to the implementation of the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. I think such partnership and dialogues are very critical because older persons have suffered the most from the COVID-19 pandemic, which is also a reflection of the long-standing systemic inequalities and lack of sufficient attention to human rights challenges faced by older persons. And certainly for our office, since the pandemic, an increasing number of our field presences are monitoring the situation of older persons and advocating for their protection. And this includes patterns of discrimination that are deeply rooted in ageism, reflected in inadequate health services for older persons, gaps in social protection, and intersecting discrimination based on age, gender, disability, and many other grounds. The pandemic also highlighted the impact of digital divide during the lockdown. Internet and digital technologies have, for most of us, have become the gateway to connect with friends and families and to access services. But for older persons, especially in less developed countries, they are least likely to have access and benefits from digital technologies. And in the face of climate change, and the last year, the Council had a discussion about the impact of climate change on older persons. They are likely to face negative impacts on their health, access to food, land, water and sanitation, housing, livelihoods, and fundamental well-being. So against all these global challenges, we now have, as our Secretary General has emphasized in our common agenda, a unique and historic opportunity to forge a world built upon a foundation of universal human rights, where every person's dignity shall be respected throughout the life cycle. But in our rapidly aging world, more than ever, older persons need stronger protection to fully enjoy their human rights. But the reality is that international legal frameworks, which should protect everybody without discrimination, still render older persons invisible. And at the root of this is ageism that you mentioned, that which takes on different forms across the life course, devaluing the contributions older persons can make to a society, eroding solidarity between generations, and having serious consequences on health, well-being, and as well as on the economy. So last year, under the Decade of Healthy Aging, the UN launched the new Global Report on Ageism, with new evidences about the prevalence and impact of ageism, as well as a possible strategy to address them. The report found that ageism is everywhere. 1 in 2 people, or half of the world population, have ageist attitudes against older or younger people. And ageism is harmful and costly because it's associated with earlier death, poor health, social isolation, and generally poorer quality of life. Ambassador Viegas mentioned the resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council, in which it was clearly recognized that ageism is a human rights issue. But again, here there's a serious problem here. In the current international framework of human rights, there's no explicit guarantee and protection against ageism, and no explicit obligation on states to take active measures to eliminate ageisms and its discriminatory consequences. So this is a significant gap and is at the root of the many of the gaps that older persons face in the exercise of their rights. Over the last 10 years, OSHR has conducted studies on the normative and protection gaps in the enjoyment of human rights of older persons. The latest report of the High Commissioner submitted to the last Human Rights Council session concluded that, 1, the existing human rights framework provides only fragmented and inconsistent coverage of the human rights of other persons, both in terms of law and practice. And secondly, the engagement by international human rights mechanisms on the rights of other persons, consequently, has been far from systematic, coherent, or sustained. And the lack of the dedicated normative instruments and a conceptual limitation on existing instruments will continue to hinder the effective protection of human rights of other persons. So where do we go from here? How can we galvanize actions and political support and to accelerate progress, as the Secretary General called for in his policy brief on COVID's impact on older persons? I conclude with 3 points. First, we need to jettison our old ageist mindset and promote new narratives on aging. The framing of this dialogue series, mainstreaming knowledge on aging, is important because knowledge is key. Older persons are a diverse group. They contribute a lot to society, to COVID response and recovery, and to climate change adaptation. So we need to embrace, value, and support their contributions. Second, following what Ambassador Viegas says, we need to build more bridges between New York and Geneva, between the Working Group on Aging in General Assembly and Human Rights Council, between human rights and social or medical approaches across ministries and UN agencies and so on. The UN Decade of Healthy Aging offers this multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder platform to do that. And lastly, we need wider, active, and more constructive engagement from all stakeholders in efforts to strengthen systems to protect the human rights of older persons. An international instrument dedicated to the human rights of older persons would offer a comprehensive framework and avoid the fragmented approach that we have currently. So we have a lot to learn from experience of Convention of the Rights of Persons against persons with disabilities, for example, and how the adoption of a specific instrument like CRPD has led to more visibility and impact in terms of changes in policies and laws at national level, and ultimately better protection of the rights of the persons concerned. We need to promote more discussions at national level. We need to gather more evidence and data that can feed into that debate, both nationally and globally. And I hope that our initiative and the series of discussions planned under this mainstreaming knowledge on aging will contribute to that effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rio. Thank you for all this food for thought suggestions, and I really liked how you framed it, that we need to get rid of this ageist mindset. And so it's like putting a new lens when we analyze what's happening, and also building bridges and learning from previous experiences on how it was done in relations to creating international instruments for other groups whose rights and whose human rights have been showcased as being subject to limitations or not being fully implemented. I think it's a wonderful start of the food for thought for the debate that's going to follow next. Thank you so much, Rio. And now to continue, we have another UN agency. We have another speaker with us, Daniel Silvari Povera. He's a policy officer, Migration and Sustainable Development Division, Department of Peace and Development Coordination. Daniel is actually the focal point on the topic of aging and related issues such as the demographic shift and intergenerational equity. Before joining this division, Daniel served as the Chief of Mission of IOM in Madagascar and for the Union of Comoros, and also as a program officer with IOM in Angola. This IOM division where Daniel is sitting has led the institutional role for the implementation of IOM strategy on migration and sustainable development, and represents the organization's direct contribute to the decade of action to fast-track progress for reaching the SDGs. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Monica. And let me start by thanking UNITAR and the co-sponsors of this series of the roundtable, and for the invitation made to IOM, the International Organization for Migration, to participate in this inaugural discussion. Very happy to be with you all. And let me also start by saying that I find very fitting that we start this series of discussion with one on the frontier issues associated with the human rights of older person. And one of those issues, certainly, we feel is migration. Migration has been historically and continues for good part to be analyzed through the lens of demography. And it should not be, therefore, so much of a surprise that population aging, which is a reality experienced in almost every country, would interact with and affect migration in many different ways. Yet there is still relatively little knowledge on this, and therefore we thought it's important to bring it to light further. And I would start by pointing out that as the world is aging, the world is also increasingly mobile. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, international migration has been, as we've seen, quite resilient. And many of the migration trends that we observed pre-COVID will likely accelerate and will also continue to be very much influenced by the demographic shift. And also by pointing out that contrary to collective representation that we have about migration, often that of young male migrants, older persons already are overrepresented in the migrant population compared to the general population. Out of the close to 8 billion people that we have in the world, slightly over 9% are above 60 years old. whereas in the international migrant population, that percentage is of 12%. Then a second point I would make is one reflecting on the opportunities and the challenges that we see at the intersection of migration dynamics and of aging dynamics. And the evidence, the general evidence that we see from the field across IOM work areas paints a picture of hardships and challenges, but also of opportunities and benefits for and with older persons in situation of migration. And I will give you just a few examples of the benefits that we see, the opportunities that we see, and then also of the challenges. Already we know that we know of the overall positive impact of migration and the agency of migrants. This is very well evidenced. We just have 3% of the global population that is in a migration situation. However, they generate 9% of the world's GDP. We know that migration is already and will continue to be also indispensable to meet some of the global, complex global and intra-regional labor market transformation that aging of society brings, and including in countries in the global south. As the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, migrants, and particularly migrant women, have been at the front line to deliver services and care, and notably elderly care in economic sectors where there's no sufficient availability of national workers. We know that migrants contribute to the welfare system of the receiving countries where they work through their labor, which translates in social benefits for the whole population, as well as through human capital, as they contribute to increase the birth rate of aging societies. When returning to their countries of origin, or when retirees migrate to another country than their own country of origin, older migrants invest their savings and pensions in the local economy. It contributes to form networks that lead to the development of businesses and services opportunities. And we know, obviously, that older migrants have also many skills and capacities. They provide leadership, they influence decision-making, they can encourage conflict resolution and foster problem-solving. And their sense of history also helps preserve the community's cultural and social identity, especially in cases of displacement where identity can erode. So we see the quite broad and diverse set of contributions that migrants can make to aging societies, and the contributions of older migrants throughout the migration cycle. But the reality is also that those contributions are hindered in many ways, and I will give you again just a few illustrations of those hindrances. When migrant workers who lose legal status in their country of destination upon retirement, or in the case of job loss, may have to return home to countries, they may do so to countries where few social and family network remains. We also know very well that older migrants often struggle to recoup the social security contributions post-retirement, and many more even struggle to move pensions with them if they choose to retire in a country, in their country of birth. As well, we see that the patterns of movement are becoming more complex for some groups, with the growing divergence between those who have the basic capacity to move and those who don't, such as the elderly. And the particular burden of those so-called trapped populations should be also given special attention. And it is quite clear that while migration can be positive, not all migration occurs in conducive circumstances. Mm-hmm. Older migrants are often isolated from the rest of society. It has been mentioned, digital exclusion, the distance from support networks, as well as the prejudices of ageist stereotypes, in addition to being sometimes discriminated based on the origin and just some of the factors that undermine their social and psychological well-being, and that actually prevent older migrants from meaningfully participate in different facets of community life. So against that backdrop, I will conclude by just laying a path forward that we see at IOM to ensure that the topic of migration and its multi-faceted interlinkages with aging is mainstream. And it would be first to acknowledge and repeat over and over again that we will not achieve the ambition of the 2030 agenda by leaving aside older persons. And just as much, we will not reach the 2030 agenda and the SDGs without due consideration of migration. We can and should embrace migration as a sustainable development strategy, including to meet and address some of the challenges that aging brings to our world. But for that, we need migrations to be well managed. And this will be my final point, to have well-managed migration that benefits all, including all the migrants. We need to have more attention to promote and protect the rights of all the migrants. And we need to have more tailored responses and solutions that enable the contributions of all the migrants to sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for not only bringing forward the many ways societies benefit from migration, how migration has shaped our societies and how it's critical to manage it and to understand the fluxes in order to reach the sustainable developments, but also for your path, the path that you've charted for us, because it makes sense when it makes complete sense when you say that we will never reach the SDGs, we'll never get to 2030 with a life with more dignity for all if we leave older persons behind, and if we don't benefit from the opportunities that engaging older persons and fulfilling their rights will bring to societies overall. And I think that's very much aligned with what Rio just said in his statement, also changing mindsets of in building societies who are much more inclusive. So I think that the two statements were in perfect flow, which is also interesting for the next part of the debate. And now let's call a different agency. Let's call a different interlocutor. And it's my honor to introduce you Roxana Vidmar-Iliescu. She's the Senior Coordinator on Digital Inclusion, ITU, and she's a focal point for older persons and for ICT digital accessibility. She advises ITU members and stakeholders on establishing policies and executing strategies to meet all people's needs in using information and communications technologies, especially for older people or persons in vulnerable situations, ensuring that everyone is included in the digital society and ecosystem. Roxana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Monica, and good morning and good afternoon to all of you. My presentation today will be on how to make a dream come true. So my dream is building a digital inclusive world. So next slide, please. Well, in fact, we like it or not, we want it or not, the technological progress, it is a reality. And this reality determines us all to live in a digital world in which these technologies impact cross-sectoral, almost all aspects of our societies and environments. So as a result, the information and communication technologies are embedded in the way we learn, buy, travel, interact with each other. In short, ICTs affect how we live as humans. So for me, it is for this reason that access to ICT is a human right and should be a priority for human rights. Now, to ensure that no one is left behind in this digital world, it is critical that ICT be developed with the needs of everyone in mind, regardless of our age, gender, or ability to use this technology. Next slide, please. So aging, it's just an inevitable part of life and affects everyone at all ages. But fortunately, we're aging in a digital world. We have the tools to live longer, to maintain active and healthier life, and make socio-economic contribution to societies, to live our lives to the fullest. However, as you can see in this interactive map, in the next 30 years, more than 2 billion people will be over the age of 60. And by the way, this includes those who are now in their 30s, because the youth of today are the old of tomorrow. And we just mentioned that technology advancement have radically changed many of our activities which take place in the digital space. Wouldn't we want to continue having access to all this as we get older? So to ensure that everyone, including older people, are fully included in these digital economies and societies, it is vital to ensure that we are all digitally included. Next slide, please. Now, before going further, I would like to say that achieving digital inclusion for all, it's a sine qua non condition to guarantee the human rights to access and use technology by everyone. And if there is still any doubt of the importance, I invite you to get back to the COVID-19 experience, during which I believe we all testified the critical situation of those who didn't have access to digital technologies. So if people cannot access the information, buy food or medicine, or connect with the doctors and families, or be able to subscribe to be vaccinated, this could cost people lives. So as you know, during COVID, most of these basic needs were almost done exclusively through the digital space. And the acceleration of internet, as shown here in this slide, was just absolutely impressive during COVID. So therefore, ensuring digital inclusion for all is ensuring that this right is respected for all people, including older person, without any discrimination. Now, on concrete, which are the pillars to achieve the digital inclusion for all? First of all, availability. So access, digital infrastructure. This is a basic, okay? But having a plug or having the Wi-Fi and nothing else, that doesn't mean that you are digitally included, because then you have to ensure the affordability to be able to pay for this access, but also for the device that you will use further to ensure your communication. And here, the most important, the accessibility part. So to be accessible, in addition to available and affordable, technology should ensure that have embedded all the accessibility feature from the design stage. So that means to be accessible technology, like the smart technology, for instance. And then we also have to ensure that everyone is capable to have the necessary skills, to have the necessary knowledge to use the technology, and even more, to appropriate this technology, means to use it by default. So if we manage to ensure that everyone have available, affordable, and accessible access to technology, this is actually what we need to ensure that everyone, regardless of gender, age, ability to use the technology or location, are included. And here, with the colleagues that just made the mention before, this is also valid. So accessibility features cannot necessarily only serve for persons with disabilities or age-related disabilities, but also for illiterates, for migrants, because they can use this technology to communicate by using this functionality. Next slide, please. So what ITU is doing, I would say the most important is that ITU establish older person as a standalone topic within the ITU Development Bureau. This was really critical. And more than this, to ensure awareness raising, as you all know, this year was really a very important year. For the very first time in the history of the ITU, we celebrated the World Information and Telecommunication Society Day, which is always on 17th of May, with a theme on digital technologies for older person and healthy aging. And I cannot thank, as I would have wished, to all of you who contributed in WISIS, colleagues from WHO, and Sylvia, we are all a family here who really put all efforts to ensure that we raise awareness strongly and together to ensure that globally all stakeholders are aware of the importance of these two global mega trends, the rise of technology and population aging, and the impact that this creates. So in line with this, we also developed some guidelines and a thematic report, Aging in the Digital World from Vulnerable to Valuable. We also developed some online self-paced training on the topic. I will share with you the links. All our resources are free of charge, so in multiple language, in digital accessible format, by the way, so can be also used by blind or deaf or illiterate people. So I really believe that in this only 2 years of existence, we have been doing quite a nice effort to spread the word and to let all our stakeholders know about the importance. Now, next slide, please. I think that the most important is not only what ITU is doing, the most important is what we can jointly do. And it's exactly what we are doing now through this fantastic initiative of UNITAR, through the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, the WISIS Forum. So I think that only by joining forces, we can actually leverage the result. Awareness raising, as already said by the previous speakers, it's so important and we have a lot to do. But after this awareness raising, we also have to consolidate efforts to support implementation by guiding, advocating, providing resources, and how we can do this better other than working together and joining forces. So the last slide, please. Well, for me, I have to say that aging is a privilege, and aging in the digital world is a chance. So everyone's work could make a difference, but only by working together and mainstreaming aging cross-sectoral and joining with all involved stakeholders, we can make the change and attain an active, healthy, and happy life for older adults of today and tomorrow. And with this, I invite you, please, to use all the ITU resources in digital accessibility, as well as in the aging. We have over 65 resources, all free of charge in multiple language. So let's use it and let's try to make a difference. Thank you very much for your attention.
No, thank you, Roxana. This was really an interesting journey through not only the resources that you've made available to all of us, but to all the thinking that's been put behind on how technologies can really help, not only to bring knowledge to all, but also to create this inclusion opportunity. And I think you've made an excellent point on how we cannot afford not to use the resources that you are not only showcasing, but also making available for all of us. So the tools are there. We just need actually to use it and put them to the service of the issues we are discussing here now. And,
exactly.
Thank you. So last but not least, I have the pleasure to welcome Alana Officer. She's the unit head for demographic change and healthy aging at the World Health Organization. She coordinated the development of the UN Decade on Healthy Aging, and she oversees WHO's work on age-friendly physical and social environments, including the global campaign to combat ageism and the global network for age-friendly cities and communities. Alana, the role of the WHO in the framework of aging and older person has been quite active and inspiring. WHO with other UN agencies recently released the UN Global Report on Ageism. UNFPA is part of that consortium, if we can call it this way. And likewise, you've addressed how is the health and well-being of older persons, of other people, being affected by climate change, and what opportunities exist to foster a healthy aging and also adapt to and mitigate and build resilience for the climate crisis in the UN's work to implement the decade of healthy aging, another frontline issue. Alana, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us from all the way from Australia in such a late hour. Thank you, Alana.
Thanks, Monica. It's really great to be here and to be with such a dynamic panel. So a huge thanks to UNITAR for coordinating this series on mainstreaming knowledge of aging, and huge thanks to all of the other UN representatives that are here. And like Daniel, I'm really excited that we're starting with some frontier issues, because I think, you know, particularly around the decade of healthy aging, we've got 9 more years. And it's really, I think, should be measured on our ability to address, you know, these key frontier issues from the beginning through to the end. So I'm going to have a bit of a chat about climate change and healthy aging. So obviously, we know that climate change and rapid population aging are occurring together. And we've heard before that older people are an incredibly diverse group. But the reality is that many of them are disproportionately affected by climate change. And that tends to happen because as we age, we have slightly greater physiological susceptibility, for example, to heat and cold. Pre-existing health conditions or disability can also increase risks with regard to climate change. So, for example, older people with health conditions tend to be much more susceptible to heat stress or cold. So heat stress, things like dehydration, it can cause increased cardiovascular strain, and it can cause increased risk of death. And older people tend to be much more susceptible to heat risk because they have sort of lower adaptability. So, for example, we have less sweating capacity as we get older, or maybe reduced blood flow and smaller cardiac output. And all of those physiological factors impact our ability to manage when our environment is really hot. Sometimes medications that you may take as an older person also increase or make it much more difficult to manage heat stress. So, for example, we don't have a lot of data, but even in Europe, nearly 20% of older people were unable to even keep their houses cool enough at level. So it's really a big problem. We also know that air pollution related to climate change exacerbates poor health in older people, particularly, again, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. And when we've got things like rising sea levels and extreme weather events like storms and typhoons and hurricanes, they can have really serious impacts on older people, physical and mental health, on their mortality, as well. So we know that those types of events also can be incredibly damaging in terms of influencing health and social support of older people and leaving them much more vulnerable. And the challenge here is that older people fundamentally have been neglected and excluded in all of the studies related to climate change. And that needs to change. Policymakers and planners really need to much better understand and hence then respond to the effects of climate change on health and well-being of older people. And it's important to remember that older people aren't just vulnerable to climate change, but they're actually agents, of change in themselves in terms of taking action around climate change and social transformation that are absolutely necessary to adapt to mitigate, and to build the sort of resilience that we need across the world, depending on the climate change scenarios. So, and clearly their knowledge, and particularly if you're thinking of elders and their experience over time, you know, of what's happened within their environments and how to manage, really trying to leverage that knowledge and experience. And I think, you know, the UN Decade obviously is intended to improve the lives of older people, their families and their communities, and to do that through a range of areas like Rio talked about in terms of tackling ageism, building physical and social environments, and improving integrated health and social care. And all of those actions need to take a human rights-based approach. You know, the intent is really that we improve the human rights of older persons. So the next 9 years really are going to be absolutely critical for both the agendas on climate change and healthy aging and the human rights of older people. So, you know, and migration. So, you know, these different and digital technologies. So all of these drivers that need to come together. So what do we need to do? First, we need to build awareness really about the links between climate change and healthy aging and climate change and human rights of older persons. We need to protect older people and put in place systems for current and future generations from climate-related threats. And that means integrating healthy aging and human rights of older people into national sectoral policies and plans on climate resilience so that our housing and healthcare services are adapted. We've got more sustainable food systems for healthier diets and health promotion. We need to get building synergies. I mean, I love this conversation, you know, looking at the linkages between technology and older persons and migration and older persons. And we need to get those synergies between the efforts that are happening around climate change and climate resilience and, for example, healthy aging. We've got the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but it doesn't mention older people really and or healthy aging. So this is an opportunity for us over time to get those synergies and to get those efforts to adopt a life course approach such that older people are not left behind. We need to develop new opportunities for collaboration and multi-stakeholder action to address climate change and foster healthy aging. You know, a great place to start with would be that older people are actually included in the assessments that take place on the vulnerability and adaptation to climate change. So there's heat mapping surveys and awareness and prevention programs for heat and cold waves, and older people should be, you know, their needs should be addressed and included in those processes. Same thing for early warning systems and making sure that they understand evacuation routes, they're accessible to them, and they're engaged in disaster risk reduction. These are really key opportunities that doesn't take anything for us to really move that forward now. You know, even things like housing and private and public buildings, they need to be much more accessible. They need to be much more energy efficient for cooling and insulation. These are opportunities to get synergies whereby we bring synergies between what needs to happen around climate change and what needs to happen around healthy aging. And we need to improve our understanding and sharing of knowledge on the science, on the policies, on the best practices on healthy aging and climate change. And with a large range of stakeholders, we've developed a platform, a knowledge exchange platform for the Decade of Healthy Aging, where all stakeholders can find and share knowledge. And this is really an opportunity to also share knowledge on climate change and its intersection with healthy aging. A couple of other things I think we really need to be doing is around the intergenerational communication, the collaboration, the solidarity that's needed, and to include older people really in supporting climate action, rather than pitting generations in a very ageist way against each other, which is counterproductive and in fact not true, in the sense that older people are incredibly active as well in addressing climate change. So maybe just to conclude, I think the next 9-10 years are going to be absolutely crucial for the agendas of both climate change and for healthy aging. And really stakeholders in both agendas need to understand those interconnections and find ways to amplify and to reinforce reinforce these two agendas such that both current and future generations of older people can benefit, as well as our home, our planet Earth. Thank you very much, Monica.
Thank you, Alana. Thank you for bringing forward not only the analysis but also the suggestions, because it's what you've said often. We know what needs to be done. We've mapped what needs to be done. Now we just need to make it happen. And it was very clear, your call to build awareness, to build synergies between climate change and healthy aging, and also the sharing of policies and knowledge. And truth is that you have a couple of questions already in the chat box that I will share in a minute, all asking for more ideas and how to raise awareness. But now for a brief wrap up, I will invite Silvia Pera-Levin. She's a familiar face to all of us, and she chairs the subcommittee on the human rights of older persons of the NGO Committee on Aging in Geneva. And it's a committee she's chaired for 8 years, from April 2014 to April 22. Silvia is an advocate for older persons, and she has been working in the fields of human rights, aging, and health for more than 23 years. She represents the NGO International Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse and the International Longevity Center Global Alliance, advocating for the inclusion of aging and older persons across the UN and promoting a UN Convention on the rights of older persons. Silvia, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Monica. Thank you, UNITAR, for this initiative and for inviting me. And I am sorry that Ambassador Gallegos didn't manage to connect, as he is so much behind and so passionate about pushing this forward. But we know that we will see him in the following roundtables. And I have the difficult task of trying to wrap up all that has been said, and a lot has been said. So you will bear with me a bit. I don't know if we will have time also to respond to some of the questions. Maybe Ana Lucia can tell me whether there will be time for Q&As. Okay, so then I will do kind of a little wrap up of what has been said and some of my opinions as well, if I may. Ambassador Villegas, who is also the president of the Human Rights Council and also passionate about the rights of older persons, really started with good points about the need of breaking through the silos, the need of moving from the development focus only, or the population aging only focus, towards a human rights approach that cuts across all areas. And that is something that we all need to remember. And I commend him and the work that him and Argentina and the 65 co-sponsor member states that co-sponsor the substantive resolution, and that this is only the beginning. And I know that we will carry on. Then he also mentions that things that also Rio strengthened, from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the fact that we need to change the ageist mindsets, that we need to change the narrative, that ageism really rules our lives. I mean, we know that ageism is probably one of the last frontiers, isms that are accepted and not contested by people. We assume it as something natural when we know it's not natural. Aging is natural. Ageism is not. So we need to learn that. But also he mentioned the fact that the report that the Office of the Human Rights, the High Commissioner released not long ago, saying that it proves that the human rights mechanisms have provided fragmented coverage on the rights of older persons. that the mechanisms, the existing mechanisms, including the covenants and the existing committees, are far from systemic or systematic in the way that they approach older persons, and that we need a dedicated legal instrument in order to solve that. We also know that existing instruments, in fact, help to fertilize the work among other committees as well, and the human rights mechanisms. So having an instrument on older persons does not mean that older persons are being segregated. On the contrary, they are further included, and they will be further included by other instruments as well. Both Ambassador Villegas and Rio have mentioned, and others, in fact, the importance of the bridges, not just the bridges between the areas or the silos on the topics, but also the bridge between New York, Geneva, countries, the national levels, and between member states, civil society, between all stakeholders. We need to carry on investing in those bridges, because really what happens in Geneva is not for Geneva. What happens in New York is not just for New York. But also that it means also brings us to what Danielle was talking about with migration. I am in Geneva today. Next week I will be somewhere else. And some people do it by choice. Some people do it by necessity. And we need to be very mindful of, especially those who really do it by necessity and have to move in order to look for employment. And that means also that many are increasingly also older migrants that may be discriminated, because on those places where they go, there are discriminatory laws regarding employment in older ages. But he also mentioned the important issue of when they go back to their countries, that they have to struggle to get their pensions that they have contributed to in those countries that they were working. So that brings me also to the issue of, when we talk about migration and those who migrate and move, we also need to be mindful of those who stay behind and don't migrate, either because they are not allowed to, or because they choose to stay and defend their house, their land, or they want to stay where they are. And we tend to forget about the older persons who stay behind when we talk about migration. And I would like to see also IOM on migration, that we talk about, as very nicely you said about the GDP, the 2% of migrants, but 9% of the GDP. We probably have similar information about older persons not being the majority. However, the contributions that they contribute to society and work and the economy are much more than what we talk about. And also I would like to de-link the connection that one makes between the migration of the young as a solution of population aging or aging societies, because I really want to say again what we say always: the aging of the society is not a problem. It's probably one of the largest or biggest achievements of humanity, of development. So we need to look, and also the fact that there are less babies being born, also we would like to say, of UNFPA puts it, is not a problem. It's also a result of women having more choice on their own birth control, on deciding how many children they want to have or not to have. So the whole issue of the migration of rights are so interlinked. The rights of having children, the rights of grow older, in equality rights with others, wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever your age, whatever your gender, whatever your economic status. And of course, what connects us all together is the technology that everybody, I think, mentioned. And of course, Roxana from ITU, and a lot of work that they have been doing lately with the report and the Information Society, the forum on ICTs and the World ICTs Day, focusing on older persons, but the realization that really almost half of the population of the older person population in the world don't have access, and many who have access may not have the literacy or know how to use it. So we need to access, we need the right for information, we need the right to be able to connect with our families that stay somewhere else, that are in different places, or the right to be able to get our own groceries if we want from our own home without having to need help from somebody else. Those are issues that really the technology can increase and help us in maintain our autonomy, which is what we want. We do not want to talk about technology only as a means for healthcare or services or industry that wants to use us for making gains. We want technology to help us maintain our autonomy and independence. And again, about Alana and the issues of climate change, and really the truth that older persons are disproportionately affected, like they are disproportionately, or they have been, or we have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic or by so many other issues, and still we are not being looked at in this with the same lens. We are not included in the framework convention on climate change, like we are not included in so many other international or intergovernmental topics, and that needs to change. And that's why it's so important that we want to mainstream the knowledge on older persons and on aging, that we really need a specific instrument, a convention, specifically on the rights of older persons, so that we can focus on what we need, what we want, with our say. And on climate change, we are not only disproportionately affected, we are also, I would even say, disproportionately active in fighting climate change. It's not true that only young people are combating climate change. Look again, when you see the news on television, the focus, look how many older persons you will see in demonstrations. We are there, we fight together alongside with the young, we fight for the young, we fight for ourselves, we fight for everybody. So others also need to think about us, see us as peers, as friends and partners, as partners in everything that happens in the world, not only on our vulnerabilities, on our risk. We want to be partners on all policy making, on everything, because everything affects us like it affects everybody else. So I think that you probably have to wrap up my own wrap up, and we all agree, we all know that we are the most heterogeneous group, that we may need help, but we also do help, that we need specific attention, but not as recipients of care or charity. We really need the attention that we deserve as full subjects of human rights in equal food with everybody else throughout our lives until our last breath. And I can come back with answering any questions if you may have. And thank you again so much. And I hope I didn't forget anybody that spoke. And thank you, Unitar, Ana Lucia, and thank you, Monica, who probably summarized better than me. Thank you.
No, Sylvia, this was just another demonstration why we don't leave you alone, why we all go to you when we need to discuss these issues and to strategize around how to better promote this agenda that, as you rightly put, matters to all of us. It's about us. And I think you even answered a couple of questions that we have on the chat. So I'm going to do something now that's not very classic when it comes to questions, but I have many questions. So I'm gonna select here 4 or 5 questions. Some of them are very much targeted in the sense that it's clear they are addressed to one of the panelists, but I'm going to put them all in the beginning so that if the other panelists want also to address one of the issues that is referring to or that is being put to another one of your co-panelists, you might just well do it. So we have a question on to Rio. Can you provide specific examples how the schism between Geneva and New York can be addressed? In Geneva, the focus is human rights, as you point out, New York is much more focused on economics and development. How would you propose to strengthen the collaboration and not, as the ambassador said, what happens in Geneva stays in Geneva? For example, how can the group of friends of older persons in Geneva collaborate more closely with the group of friends of older persons in New York and be more proactive in securing more members to the group in New York? And this is connected, Rio, with another question to you on how to educate the public on age discrimination. What plans could be implemented? Then we have also more than one question to Danielle on, and I think this one kind of summons up. Unfortunately, the reality, Danielle, is that sometimes older person issues are not considered a priority in certain countries. As a result, although willing and creating strategies to tackle all this is being said in this webinar, they are constantly delayed or put aside at higher levels. Is it best more pressure to put in the countries for further up or from further up on our governments? Because this is related with the previous question on promoting migration population with a focus on older persons. So they ask you for your plans and your suggestions. And then for Oksana, I like the idea of digital inclusion plan. How can we enact this plan without being affected by cancel culture? Okay, what can we individually do to combat the digital divide? No, I'm struggling because I bought a new pair of glasses, but there's something wrong with them, so I'm struggling to increase the size of the letters so that I can read it. And how can we individually do to combat the digital divide? And then for Alana, is there any ways, possibilities to engage older people with mainstream economic activities and the social protection regime in the emerging economies or developing countries? And what are some ways we can increase awareness to the public and avoid discrimination for older persons? And there was one that can be asked to anyone, one on WHO, increasing awareness and links between global child intelligence and what affects health. But Alana, you've spoken about this if you want to go back to it. And all the women and the sexism overlays lifelong discrimination also. And another question on the, will we be able to meet the 9-10-year plan deadline, the decade on healthy aging, and also the sustainable development issues? So, but please choose what you think you are most fitted to answer. And I have also one message that says, thank you for this incredible webinar. So I thought this is not a question, but it's something that you should also hear. So the floor is yours. I'm going to do the same order as we did in the beginning, if you don't mind. So Rio, I'm going to let you go first, please.
Thank you. I'll try to be short. And I think both of the questions is about bridging the divide. And first, between New York and Geneva, I was hoping that Ambassador will say something more on this, but I think, well, first of all, I think Silvari is right, because within each country, within each government, that bridge should be built, because the UN is a meeting of member states. So if there is a divide between the UN, it's a reflection of how the national governments are working. So human rights colleagues and medical and social welfare colleagues really need to get together. And to me, somebody said, everything that we do has to be partnership, and I strongly agree, because we as Human Rights Office, we learn a lot from working with Alana in WHO, colleagues in ILO, on how those international standards and principles can be implemented on the ground. And the important thing for us, for all of us, is that we will establish that standards and principles informed by data, evidence, and practices, and that implementation of that standards follow the human rights guidelines and principles. And for that, it's absolutely necessary that there'll be more dialogues, more discussions, more disagreements, and among different disciplines, and only that we can come to a higher ground. And the second thing about education, the global report on ageism, I invite everybody to read that. It has many suggestions for possible strategies, including on education. And I think the key here is that when I talked about bridge, I forgot to talk about intergenerational. We need to bridge between the generation, bridge between old and young, and there are wonderful examples of how during the COVID, younger people and older people got together to look at how older people can use those iPads and so on, but also the sparks more intergenerational dialogues and activities that contribute to addressing ageism and age discrimination. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rio. Thank you. Danielle, I think you were next.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you to the participants for the questions. I would fold the two into one, and I would just say very briefly also, because I see we are past the hour, but the way that we can maximize the benefits of migration, and that is the benefits for the migrants themselves and in the first place, but also for the communities where they come from, where they transit, and where they're going to, is one, to ensure that migration is a choice, right? And Sylvia alluded to that as well. Two, that for those who make the choice to migrate, then that they are empowered as actors for development. And three, that migration is well governed. Now, we need to look very clearly at what this means for older persons in particular and throughout the migration cycle, because it will mean a different thing than other groups of the population and groups of them. I will give one example that has a lot of our attention at IOM in coordination also with other colleagues at notably ILO in this case, but it's all around the issue of the portability and the access to social security contributions. We have, primarily because most of the migrants in the world, 60% of the migrants in the world, migrate for the purpose of work, right? So this is an important group of migrants in itself. And we know that only one in every four of those migrants is in a country that has a mechanism for access and portability of social security contributions. That means that 3 of every migrants doesn't have a full and I would say quality coverage at the moment. And we know that in those that are not in a country where this is possible, those migrants primarily come from the global south. So it adds on also a number of vulnerabilities because those older migrants, they go back to a country where the social safety net is weaker or incomplete, and that's a problem. Now, going to the second question, and on the basis of what I've just said, I would say that there's 2 ways, and we need to balance according to the situation in which we find ourselves. But I would say that there's a carrot and then there's a stick. The carrot is that this is in the self-interest of countries, of their governments, to include all the migrants, to recognize the right of older migrants and put in place the structure to ensure that through those setups, the migrants and all the migrants can realize their full potential and contribute to the societies where they are. But also we need to use the stick sometime because we need to hold those countries to account to the standards that they committed to. And although there's not a unique framework or global instrument, a legal instrument, There are a number of instruments that colleagues have mentioned and that have been mentioned at the start that enable still to clearly see what are the fundamental principles that we need that countries need to be held to account to. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you. And Roxana, the floor is yours now.
Yeah, so thank you for this question, which are coming from Alaina Lely and from Bianca Moisa. I will also put together in interest of time. So yes, how to achieve this plan of digital inclusion in a good way? Well, first, try to lead by example. Perhaps even inside here within UN, we still work per silos. So it's really the great time when we are working in digital inclusion to try to have a holistic vision, to try to address this in a holistic way. I'm a woman, but I can also be a young, an old, an indigenous woman, and with disabilities. So if we continue with working per silos, it will be very difficult to achieve this goal. This is one side. And Bianca was saying how we can do everyone, each of us, how we can concretely contribute. And I would say that in addition to raising awareness of the need that everybody can have access to this, and through our respective works and activities to try to contribute as a personal level, I think the intergenerational support is critical. So in particular for this part of the aging, as mentioned by Mr. Handa. So I definitely think that by trying the young generation to be a little bit more close to the older generation, to share from their, let's say, abilities and being more technical savvy. And I see also this between me and my daughter. So I have to say that this is for all of us. And also, if technology, if industry manufacture, if private sector, if governments, if we all only work and want to have accessible technology, which means accessible for all, this will facilitate a lot access to information and communication technology. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Roxana. And now, Lana, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Monica. So in terms of the question regarding economic activity, I mean, as part of the decade, it's really intended to improve the lives of older people, their families and their communities in all 193 countries. So obviously in terms of low and middle income countries as well. And one of the key strategies for doing that is the work that happens around one of the prior areas, which is the action area around building communities that can foster the abilities of older people. And that's around how can you create opportunities for employment and volunteering, improved access to social protection, improved lifelong learning. So really addressing all of the what we say key determinants of healthy aging in that sense, all of those factors that enable people to live well. So really the decade is intended and largely is part of the work that we do through creating more age-friendly cities and communities as an opportunity to really try and bridge that gap for people who are in a position to be able to continue to work. And for those that can't, what can be done around improving social protection and support. So it's really a key aspect of the work that will be happening around the decade. It's a key aspect of the work that also happens within MIPA as well. So really an important focus for older people.
Thank you, my dear. Thank you. And Sylvia, I don't think you wanna jump in? So this was, I think this was, as someone wrote in the chat box, I think this was an amazing webinar. I think we managed to fulfill some of the very ambitious objectives that the webinar had on sharing practices, on identifying gaps and challenges, but also opportunities. But I think the main achievement of this webinar was how much knowledge was shared. And I think that's precisely the purpose of this webinar, sharing what each one of us is doing, sharing which challenges we have mapped, but also the solutions. We don't need to be constantly reinventing the wheel. We can just leverage from whatever has been achieved in other processes, in other forums, and this was one of the main goals of the webinar. UNITAR will share in the upcoming days with the participants the video of the event, together with some key takeaways and key messages, as well as other links of interest, of references that were made during the webinar. And because we spoke a lot of bridging, I would like to invite you all for the second event of this series, that it's called Two Worlds, Same Goal, Ongoing Efforts at the UN General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council for the Rights of Other Persons. It's going to be held on Thursday, the 30th of June, 2022, and it really follows suit with some of the challenges and some of the issues that were raised here in this webinar. So the dates of the upcoming event are on screen, as you see, and you need to register again. If you registered once, sorry, there's no need to register again. You'll be receiving kind reminders from UNITAR. And now it's my honor and my privilege to close this webinar. Wrap up with Sylvia. Sorry, Sylvia, I'm trying to steal your job. And thank you all for having joined us this afternoon. I hope you found this insightful, truthful, and educational, because that's the overall goal of what we have been doing here. Thank you, UNITAR, for having invited UNFPA to join as moderator. I know I've learned a lot, and I've also got my marching orders for what I need to do next. Thank you very much, and wishing you all a wonderful day, evening, afternoon. Thank you, Ana Lucia, and thank you to all the panelists who generously gave their time to be here with us, and to all the participants.
Thank you.